No, you're fine. This is good. All right, I'm looking forward to our lesson tonight. We're looking at the portraits of Old Testament individuals. I've chosen Gideon for our lesson tonight. I'm really thankful for our devotional for Alex. When he mentioned the judges, I thought it's perfect. I had no idea he was going to be doing that. But when he connected the judges to the chaperones and every judge would die, I just thought, oh no, that is not what we want with a lock-in. No. But I love the correlation that he had and the connection. That was really great insight into what's been going on and the youth program. That is exciting. If you will, turn to Judges chapter 6. We're going to be looking at Gideon. And as Alex mentioned, what would take place is the children of Israel would follow God during the judge's reign, and as a judge would pass away, they would fall away. And so here's a situation where in Judges chapter, not sure, is that, there's some feedback. Okay, there we go. All right, is that good? Okay. Here. All right, Judges 6, 11 through 13. Who has that? All right, Meryl's got it. All right. I also gave Christian the verses, so he's still passing some of those around. So you may get a verse. All right, be ready. If you want a verse, let Christian know. He'll give it to you. All right.
Okay.
Mr. Rodney has those.
Oh, okay. Rodney's got them. Okay. All right, Meryl.
Okay, Judges 6, 11 through 13. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abizarite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites.
All right, thank you for that reading. And you notice God says to Gideon, you mighty man of valor. But did you ever stop and think, where was he? He's hiding in the wine press. Is he pressing out wine? No, he's threshing. This is not the threshing floor. He's dividing up the chaff from the wheat, and he's preparing this, but he's hiding it. Why? Because the Midianites would come and steal the wheat, and so he's hiding from them. You don't usually think about a mighty man of valor hiding from the enemy. And so I want you to stop and think about what is God saying when he sees Gideon. He doesn't just see him where he is, he sees him in his future. So I've called this Gideon's courage. You don't really see someone who's courageous, who's sitting there hiding from the enemy, but God sees not as man sees. And it's interesting, Gideon sees something that just isn't right. And notice he said, God has forsaken his people. What happened to all this getting us out of Egypt stuff? And so it's interesting to me, he sees that God had forsaken his people, but it really wasn't the case. They had forsaken God. God wanted Israel to rid themselves of the Canaanites, if you recall, as they were coming into the promised land in Judges 2, 1 through 5. Who has that? All right, Mike's got it.
Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this thing that you have done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out from you, but they will become like thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. Now when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people raised their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochum, and there they sacrificed to the Lord.
So it's interesting, Gideon believes that the Lord had forsaken his people, that had given them up. And he even mentions the Lord was going to bring us up from Egypt. What happened? And in Judges chapter 2, God says, I brought you out of Egypt. I led you into the land that I promised. But he said to never break his covenant by not making a covenant with the Canaanite peoples. And yet they did make covenants with the Canaanite people. They did not eradicate the sinful nature of what was around them. And so they became part of what they were doing. They didn't obey God. So God told them what he wanted them to do. They disobeyed God. So God also gave Israel what they wanted. So the consequences of their disobedience. Let's see. Can you advance it to the second slide? It's not. There we go. God gave them what they wanted. In chapter 11 through 15, who has that? Of Judges 2.
And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress.
So that terrible distress carried on from when they first heard that they had disobeyed God, and therefore there was going to always be a snare for them because of the peoples that they decided to live around. And notice, remember in verse 4, they wept loudly when they heard of this, so they named that place Bochum and offered sacrifices there to the Lord. It's interesting, they still wanted to worship God, but they also decided to worship the gods of the peoples surrounding them, specifically Baal and Asherah or Ashtaroth. And so this angered God because, well, the commandment is, I, the Lord your God, am one. You shall worship only one God. And so this was the problem of not obeying the promise. God held true to his end of the bargain. They did not. So that was the consequences of their disobedience. But God still remembers his promise, and so that's why we have verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. All right, so they forgot God, but God did not forget his promise. Therefore, he would raise the judges and would free the people. It would constantly remind them that they needed to look to God. But ironically, they would look to the judge. And the judge would often fall away or die, and they would then fall back. It's still amazing that Alex went there, and I had no idea he was going to do that. It's wonderful. So in the third place, the people did not remember their God, even though God remembered them. Judges chapter 2, verses 17 through 19. Brandon's got that.
But they did not listen to their judges. Instead, they prostituted themselves with other gods, bowing down to them. They quickly turned from the way of their fathers, who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. They did not do as their fathers did. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. The Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned, because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. Whenever the judges died, the Israelites would act even more corruptly than their fathers, going after other gods to worship and bow down to them. They did not turn from their evil practices or their obstinate ways.
Thank you. And so this is why they didn't remember their God, even though God had remembered them. They didn't listen to the judges. But I think it's important. Verse 17 shows the importance. I think we stop and think about how they worshipped these objects. When they worship Baal or they worship Ashtoreth, I stop and think, what was the pull? What was the drive to bow down to an inanimate object? But verse 17 shows, it says they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. So they committed adultery against the God of creation. And it's very important to bring out, and it's very graphic, though it's disturbing. The Baal and the Asherah went together because Baal was the god of war and fertility, and Asherah was the goddess of fertility. And so when you have a god of fertility and a goddess of fertility, you can imagine what that worship was. And we as a society have given into that very same thing. It's not this picture. Imagine these uprights that are holding up this building. Imagine each one of them is a different god, and some people are bowing over here. It's not that picture. They're completely given to the pleasure of sin that the world around them is doing. And so when we're going through this, may we never put them at arm's length and say, oh, that doesn't relate to us. Because we as a society fall victim to this. And because of that, it's a temptation for us to fall away as well. So the people did not remember their God, but we need to remember that God continued to remember them because judges continued to come, and Gideon is being called at this moment. So there were still consequences of not obeying. Judges 2:20 through 23. All right, Rodney, I've got that.
So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenants, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in as it was in their fathers did, or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hands of Joshua.
So it's interesting. In order to test Israel, he allowed the nations to camp around them, and they did not leave. And it would test them. He says, I'm no longer going to drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. So now we understand where Gideon is, why he's hiding the wheat in the winepress. It was the Midianites who would come in, and it's even said that they'd come in like grasshoppers, and they would literally just eat up all of the produce that they had. No wonder he's trying to hide. But when God says, you mighty man of valor, remember he said, what about Egypt? What does that tell us about Gideon? He remembered the words of God, and he's looking for God's deliverance. He's the perfect candidate to lead the people because he remembers what God's promise was in a world or a society that had forgotten. So now we understand the need for Gideon's courage because they're constantly being captured. They're constantly being plundered. Judges 6:14 through 16. Who has that? Oh, all right. Jeff's got it.
The Lord looked at him and said, Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? He said to him, O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man.
So it's interesting. He's saying, go in your strength. But again, what strength does Gideon see? He's hiding in the winepress. God, you're the one that said, I'm a mighty man of valor. You're the only one talking about strength here, not me. And he even says the opposite of what God's saying. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and Manasseh being the older son, but not the one who received the promise from Joseph. And so he's the least of the clans within the least of the tribes of Israel. I'm the lowest of the low. I am the smallest of the small. How on earth are you talking about this? Where are you getting this idea of this might of mine? I'm the least. And now he's even saying, and I'm the least in my father's house. So there's no one smaller than Gideon in Gideon's eyes. So let's keep that in mind. You know, when we're called to step up, to strive to be an influence for God, remember in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 12, he gave the apostles, the prophets, the shepherds, the evangelists, and teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. As saints, we can have the same response, but I am the least in my Father's household. I am the smallest. What can I do? And this shows where God sees not as man sees. I think that's extremely important, especially when it comes to 1 Samuel 16, verse 1, and then 6 through 7. Who has that? All right, Bob Keith's got it.
The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart."
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. This gives an example of who God chooses to lead his people. He sees the heart of the person. And I think it's very important, a very good quality for a leader to have. It's vital to be humble, to have humility. Who am I? How can I do this? So it was a process for Gideon to be the man of valor for God. So obviously in his eyes, it was a process that was never going to take place in the first place, because to him, he didn't see it, but God saw it. And so he allows for this growth of Gideon, and I think that's where I want to follow this for the remainder of this portrait of Gideon. Gideon's courage was a process, and it's something that we need to realize we're all in that process. We're all where we are. We can't change that. But I think sometimes we give into this mentality that, well, I am who I am, and I can't change. I'm not going to change. The only one who has the ability to say, I am who I am, is who? God. God is the only one that does not change. And so we can all grow in our courage just like Gideon did. So let's keep this in mind. So Gideon needed proof. So I think it's very important as a leader that he's asking for proof. We can do the same. Judges 6, 17 through 24. Ryan's got it? Okay.
And he said to him, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "I will stay till you return." So Gideon went into his house and prepared a young goat and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the terebinth and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock, and pour the broth over them." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, "Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die." Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites.
Thank you. So Gideon is much like Moses. He needed the proof that he was going in the name of the Lord. And here Gideon receives the proof, and he creates this unleavened cake with the meat, and it is consumed with fire from a rock. That's not normal. And he immediately knows, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face, but now he fears that he's going to die. He's saying, you're not going to die, but he's being prepared to be the leader for God's people. And I think it's interesting to me in Acts chapter 2 and verse 22. It reminds me of this. Who has that? All right, Tim's got it.
Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know.
Thank you. So you have this example of Jesus coming with signs and wonders to prove that he was the Son of God. So for us to follow God, we need to understand that is perfectly understandable, and so it was fine for Gideon to seek after proof. Gideon needed to get his house in order first, and so again, the concept of Gideon being a leader for God, there's still a lot going on at home that is not right, and for him to be able to lead the people, he had to make sure his house was in order. Rick?
Yeah. Before I won't take too much time out of your class, but Gideon is just such a great Bible character, and thank you for bringing out those things.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of going to Harding College with Hank McDaniel, who was a professor at Freed-Hardeman eventually, and I saw Hank perform Gideon in the play of the same name by Chayefsky. And the character of Gideon so came alive in that play. I don't know if it's that way every time it's performed, but I really had an appreciation for Gideon the man, and as you pointed out, the least in his family, and just the interaction he had with the angel and so forth. But if it's done well other places, it would be a good read or a good view.
Right.
Judges 6:25 through 27.
Yeah.
That night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and the second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night.
So, again, in true Gideon fashion, he hid under cover of night to be able to do what God asked him to do. But notice his own father has an altar to Baal, and he has Asherah poles, and so these are like wooden, like totem poles, what our understanding is. But his own father is worshiping these objects. So Gideon feels this personally, that this has been affected by his own family because of the nations surrounding him. So it's interesting that he would say, take your father's bull and the second bull 7 years old and pull down the altar. If I'm not mistaken, the second bull would be the one that's coming up. So, again, what does his father need the bull for? The bull is generally, that's going to be his livelihood, most likely. So for him to kill the bull, man, how are you going to replace it? This is worse than wrecking the family car, as far as I'm concerned. How is he going to, he's doing this to his own father. Okay, so keep this in mind. So that brings us to the third point. Gideon converted his family first. God is establishing something for him to do to help convert his family from Baal worship, from Asherah worship. Judges 6:28 through 32. Who has that? All right. Ansel.
And when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? After they had searched and inquired, They said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah. But Joash said to all them who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar.
Look at the wisdom from his father. And I think it's also important. He says if Baal's altar can be torn down, if Asherah's totem poles can be cut down, and not only did he took the totem poles, cut them up, and used it as kindling to burn the bull. What is the bull in comparison to Baal? Remember, Baal is the god of war and fertility, but he was also the symbol of a bull. Asherah was the tree. So what's interesting is what they were worshiping became kindling and was then roasted on that kindling. So they have an evidence, they have an example that their God that they've been worshiping, being the bull, has now been roasted on what they once were worshiping as the Asherah. If that's not an evidence, if that's not damning concerning that these are not gods, they are obviously being burned up before us. That's what his father needed to see, because that meant that they were honest in their worship to these gods, believed that they really were. So he's saying, if he really is a god, let him contend for himself. But if anybody harms Gideon, they'll be killed by morning. So he converts his family by doing what God told him to do. But how easy would it be for him to say, man, God, you're asking me to do something very hard. How can I do this to my own father, his two bulls? How can I do that? God knows best, and it converts the family. That is it. That's exciting to me to see this. So how did Joash become, my question was, how did Joash become converted so quickly? Because Baal was represented as a bull. But notice it's interesting, Baal is also, he's the god of war. This brought on a war. In verses 33 through 35, who has that? All right, Brother Jeffries.
Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the peoples of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Amorites were called out to follow him. And he sent messages throughout all the Manassas, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messages to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went to meet them.
So this brought on a war. By Gideon doing this wasn't just a family issue. Now this is brought on. Notice the Midianites, Amalekites are getting this, and the Abiezrites are getting this war against him. These are all nations that should have been eradicated from the words of God, and they didn't. And so war is on them because they're now trying to follow God. And so it's going to be hard. When we disobey God, it's going to cause the upsetting of the apple cart, if you will. We've got to trust God regardless of the war that would come. So Gideon here needed yet another sign. Judges 6, 36 through 40. Who has that? All right, Philip. Christians jogging. It's a sight to see. Good job, man.
Then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hands, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hands, as you have said. And it was so, when he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and all the ground there was dew. This
is profound. I love this request from Gideon, and it shows that God allows him again to request a sign. But he's saying, if I'm going to get outside of this wine press, if I'm going to do this not under the cover of night, I need proof. I need evidence. And God is willing to oblige. So now that Gideon believed God, God needed Gideon to sweat a little bit. Judges 7, 1 through 7, and we have about 4 minutes left. I think we can finish it up based on this. Who has it? All right, Jeff.
Then Zerubbabel, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all of the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home.
You know, this is definitely not something you would read in the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. This is not something that you would read in any man of war who studies the art of war. For instance, I read something from a veteran of the Civil War who just told about what it was like, and I thought it was pretty neat to hear his perspective. He saw that the Union soldiers got more food, so he and his father enlisted because they wanted food. They didn't think about all the other stuff. But what was interesting is he says he was scared to death, but they were lined up on the front lines, and as everyone was shot and died, the next line would come over them, right? And he was more afraid of the people behind him than the people in front of him, because if he got afraid and he tried to run away, the line behind him would shoot him. That's how they handled those who were afraid, to keep them in line. What happened here? Whoever is fearful and trembling may turn back and not get shot. They can turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 of the troops turned back, but 10,000 remain. You got to see, Gideon's going to be sweating here. What? Just 10,000? And then he hears there's still too many troops. And I've always thought about how, you've got people who, they're thirsty. They immediately fall on the water and they start drinking it up. But only 300 were willing to kneel down, and they licked it up with their hand. It shows that those who were the 300, they were alert. They were paying attention. They would see the enemy. But also those 300 would understand that they didn't do this. They did not destroy the Midianites. Only God could. So he used the 300 who were alert, who'd be able to relay the message that God had defeated their enemy. So again, God wanted Gideon, who was the smallest in his house, in the smallest clan, in the smallest tribe, to be able to lead the smallest army to defeat the greatest at the time. So I think Gideon is an incredible example for us of courage. He wasn't born with it, but he grew into it. And so wherever we are in our life, we may not be born with it, but we can grow into it. And I thought it was interesting. Alex said, I did what Richard had asked me to do. Anytime someone asks you to do it, be willing to say yes when it comes to speaking or comes to something. I remember someone telling me that same thing when I was much younger, and I just said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And it just so happened around that same time someone asked me to speak, and I was scared to death. Maybe not like Gideon with there's still too many people, but we never know what God can do in bringing us along in striving to serve Him. All right, that's our time. We're a minute over, so let's go to God in prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father God, we bow before you, and I'm just so thankful that we have the example of Gideon, who in his own eyes and his own right was the least of everyone in that nation, but you saw something strong. You saw something mighty. You saw yourself being able to lead the people through his humility. And I just pray that we will be like Gideon, and we will allow you to work through our lives, and that we'll be willing to simply step up. We'll be willing to open our mouth. And Father, I pray that you'll use us for your glory to bring more sons and daughters to it. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Thank you all.